I've taken to volunteering for the Ottawa Tool Library, and I do repair cafes, and I fix random people's toasters. It brings me hope.
Nice. I just got my door handle fixed this morning so that I can reliably go in and out.
Hey, there you go.
I'm gonna bring you my Ninja toaster oven, Craig.
Right
The,
on. I'll do
the
it.
electronics are on the fritz. I know what's going on with it.
Whoa, look at that. We're just about, we're 10 seconds away. So have a good webinar, everybody. And yeah, see you in there. I'm going to start it. Tom, as soon as you see this go to black,
Yep.
my logo, that means that you can begin. Okay?
Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's timely discussion, Protecting Canada's Future in Uncertain Times. My name is Tom Cooper. I'm director of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. I wasn't intended to be today's moderator, but I'm stepping in for our friend Laura Katari, who's off sick today. But let me begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Hamilton, which is located on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a promise to share and care for the land and protect the resources around the Great Lakes region in peace and in cooperation. And as we reflect on today's webinar and the questions around sovereignty and democracy and the future of our country, it's vital that we also recognize the enduring presence, strength, and contributions of Indigenous communities, both historically and today. So we're gathering today at a pivotal time in Canada's history. Donald Trump, as we all know, has returned to the White House, and the impacts are already being felt in our country. His administration has imposed crippling tariffs on Canadian goods, threatened key sectors of our economy, and openly challenged Canadian sovereignty economically, diplomatically, and politically. At the same time, here in Canada, we are in the midst of a federal election where one looks at the deep divisions, rising populism, and uncertainty about our economic future and has put it all front and center for us. So we have a lot of questions to explore today. How does Canada protect its future in these turbulent times? How do we safeguard not only our economy, but our democracy and our independence and our social programs, which help define who we are as a country? We're incredibly fortunate to have three thoughtful and engaged panelists to unpack many of these complex issues. So I'm going to introduce them first before I dive into the questions, and I'd like to introduce Margaret Skimba, who is a columnist with the Hamilton Spectator. In a recent thought-provoking piece lamenting for a nation in the time of Trump, Margaret explored the growing influence of American political culture on Canada and what it means for our national identity and sovereignty. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Peter Graefe. Peter is an associate professor of political science at McMaster University. He's one of Canada's leading voices in examining federalism, social policy, and the political economy, bringing a sharp analytical lens to what's happening in this election and what it means for Canada's future. And finally, last but not least, Sheila Reguer is chair of the Basic Income Canada Network. She's been a national advocate for income security and resilient social infrastructure. Sheila has spent decades working to advance policies that protect and uplift Canadians, especially in difficult times. So I'm thrilled to have all three of you here, and also like to thank Craig Pickthorn for providing our technical support in the back. But let's get right into the question. So Margaret, I'm going to start with you. In your recent column, you reflected on Lament for a Nation. and fears about Canada losing its distinctiveness and autonomy. How real are those fears today with Trump back in the White House and pressure mounting on Canada?
Well, I think they're really present with us today. But it's not just Trump, of course, because if we look back to the pre-Trump times, just last year, we're still looking at the creeping Americanization of some of our social programs like healthcare and prison delivery system and other aspects of our social services that are being solely privatized, which is a pre-Trump, but an American. It's only sort of taken off over that. Taken off with Trump sort of exponentially. In terms of our fear about our distinctiveness, we've got two things that are sort of working or that we're in fear of. And one is our cultural identity, and the other one is our economic. You mentioned diplomatic. I hadn't really thought of that. But in terms of our cultural and economic identity and how those two actually combine together, we're at a significant crossroads in who we are and how we see ourselves moving forward, separate from the United States and their huge influence on who we are culturally and economically.
Thanks, Margaret. That's a really good prelude, I think, to the rest of our conversations. We're going to dive a little bit further into the federal election. So, Peter, I'll move to you. This federal election, I would say, and we probably wouldn't get a whole lot of argument, is kind of unique. But can you unpack for us what makes it different, particularly given the external pressures from Trump's America, and also what it means in terms of the internal polarization we've seen in this country over the last several years, particularly since the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty rare that you have an election where people are so scared. I mean, I think they're scared in some ways about, the sort of threat of annexation. But I think, like we saw in the Ontario election as well, there's a real fear that things are going to go really badly economically. And we've actually started to see things like the announced layoffs at Ingersoll and so on. But we're not really sure exactly what that's going to look like yet, right? We haven't lived this before. And so people are fearful and they're worried. And as with most things in life, when you're fearful and worried, your attention narrows, maybe we begin to sort of focus on a smaller number of issues. And so it means that the range of debate that I think we're used to in a federal election, the range of issues that will be brought in and discussed and where we're making decisions has been really narrowed in our discussion. So I think that's, an important change. I mean, we do see a change in how people are in politics, how they do politics. If we go back 20 years, people are watching nightly newscasts, they're reading newspapers, they're getting a story of Canada written by the mainstream news. Very few of us are actually consuming the election that way this time. And so it provides a lot of opportunity for more ideological polarization, which can't always be a terrible thing. It does give us a broader range of views, but in many cases, we're getting very thin amounts of facts, and in many cases, very skewed facts being presented. And I think it makes it a lot harder to protect a sense of elections as a public moment where we as citizens can get together and make decisions together based on a relatively shared group of facts. And then we can make decisions based on what the different parties are presenting to us. I mean, in some ways, this election maybe has reduced some of the impact of that because of such a concern with national unity that there's a bit of a rallying of trying to understand what maybe brings us together. But in a way, I'm struck by how thin that sense of Canada is, tied really to, washed up comedians and so on who come up and give presentations. I'm struck, in 1988, when we had the last sort of big election, I think, about Canada's national relationship to the United States, we talked about what made Canada different, and an important thing was social programs. But this time around, the sort of sense of solidarity that we've built together in this country over the long haul in terms of the policies we've produced, that's really absent from the discussion, either because we've forgotten that about ourselves, or maybe we've let that difference fritter away by not investing in those places. But that's certainly a part of the discussion of, Canada and its sovereignty that really hasn't been at the forefront of the discussion. But one maybe we want to see brought back as the election continues.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And that's a really great segue, I think, to ask Sheila the next question. But before we get to that, I'll just remind our audience members that we have a little Q&A chat box. It will be right on the bottom right hand of your screen. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please jot them down in that Q&A box, and we will try to get to them at some point during our conversation over the next 50 minutes or so. So Sheila, taking what Peter said about Canada's social infrastructure, how do strong social programs like income security programs or universal pharmacare, which is more recent, help protect Canada against both economic shocks and external threats like the one that Peter described coming from the US?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, there's so much going through my mind when I think about all of these things. And I think Peter was spot on. And what Margaret said too, like we do have this kind of thin sense of solidarity, but I think it's not, but it's like, it's about buying Canadian, about checking what you're getting at the grocery store and, making sure where it's made. But part of our culture, part of our values, part of what makes us us is the social programs. I mean, this is what government is. This is who we are together. And I actually see the American and the complete, almost global remaking of things as much more political than economic. Economics is an abstraction, but these political things about who we are as a country, who we are as individuals in that country, and it's our social programs that help make us us. So it's a way that we can identify with each other, we help each other, we work things out together. And for Canada, especially in the face of this behemoth to the south of us, that really matters now. And it really is going to matter to our future going forward. So they're like our social programs, the things that we all rely on, and the ones that you've pointed out are universal. The universal ones really matter because that's what unites us. Canada also has lots of programs that are divisive. Don't need those. But I'm reminded too of, the inspiration that we get from history. Like, I agree with Margaret, like this moment hasn't come about in the last few years. We've been getting here. But I keep going back to Martin Luther King Jr., who was very much in the forefront of civil rights. But those civil rights were not just about voting for him. They were about Black and white people having economic freedom in the country to actually make a living and survive and be part of society.
Exactly. And excellent points. Thank you so much, Sheila. So I'm going to flip back to you, Margaret. Are there particular Canadian values, institutions, or social programs that you see as particularly at risk right now or particularly vulnerable and need of defending?
Well, I'm going to go with healthcare. I think that's our flagship social program is universal healthcare, and it came about at a particular time when we had a sense of helping one another and wanting to be the kind of country that provided for the vulnerable and the needy, and that sort of comes up in this universal healthcare. That, I think, is the one that's the most at risk. It was at risk before Trump. It's at risk now. It's at risk, if I could say, even from the doctors that are coming back to Canada from the States. Are they bringing back an Americanized version of healthcare with them that they want to incorporate here, or are they going to? They left for a reason. You know, if they were Canadian, they left for a reason. If they're American, they stayed for a reason. Are they going to be able to transition themselves to be able to providing care under a universal healthcare model? That I think is something that for most people in Canada, we have no idea, no real appreciation of what we could lose if we lose universal healthcare. We don't know medical debt. We don't know it medical debt to the extent that they know it in the States. We still know it around lost jobs and lost income around other aspects of healthcare. But we don't know how much it costs. We don't know what it's like to feel hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt because you've elected to save the life of a loved one. And I think that is probably the thing that's most at risk. And then falling under that is disability rights and disability justice. That with the increasing, I'm going to say emphasis on MAID and how it works with healthcare, we have to be really careful that we're not falling into a callous comes to mind, but it is a sort of callous way in which we're viewing lives that may or may not have physical value in our world today. So those are the two things that I would say that are ours in terms of Canadian values, and that are also at most risk of being lost.
Yeah, that's very important points, and I hadn't considered your point about doctors coming from the United States to Canada and whether they may bring some of those sort of more capitalist bent philosophies to the healthcare system here. That's something interesting to think about. I'm going to flip that question a bit on its head for Peter, and kind of throwing this at Peter out of the blue a bit. But I know Peter's done some research. The Roundtable has worked with Peter and his colleague Mo Ferdosi, looking at the impact of income security programs during the pandemic, particularly CERB. Peter, do you see that sort of response as being a possibility, given the potential for economic upheaval in Canada as a result of tariffs and potential job losses? What were some of the benefits that you saw for workers and other people, other Canadians who were able to gain access to CERB, and what were some of the challenges with that system? And do you see perhaps government implementing something similar if it turns out that there's a need for an enhanced and sort of refined income security program in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think, with the predicted job losses that may be coming with the tariffs, we have to wonder whether the employment insurance system is going to be up to the task. I mean, the reason we had CERB in 2020 was that we just knew that too many people were not going to be supported by that. So it may be that the sort of the ability to respond to important losses of employment through a universal program is a much more effective way than through the targeting of employment insurance. Now, I mean, the CERB was around for about 6 months, so in a very sort of special situation. So, I mean, it would be hard to draw too many, lessons from that. But certainly it was important in allowing people to move in and out of work. And for people who may have been at the edges of the labor market to sustain a level of social participation, that they had sufficient income to undertake training, to take risks of moving into new jobs, and to be able to make sure that those new jobs reflected, their skills and capacities. So, we certainly could think of this as a moment of crisis, as one where we have to rethink how we provide assistance to people in the labor market. And again, the openness of it allowed a lot of people to have the support they needed. I mean, the OECD talks about the importance of having some kind of minimum social standards, but also things that allow people to flow through the labor market and through different stages of their lives and their caring responsibilities and so forth. And so, yeah, if we could rethink EI in this context or have our parties do that, that would be a useful moment in this election. I mean, one shortcoming with CERB that was noted by a lot of people is that if you were on social assistance, in most cases, you didn't have access to it. And so, you know, an issue in this moment is that when we consider the people being knocked out of the labor market, we maybe also think about the people who are more or less disqualified from it because they're forced to live in such states of poverty that they're unable to engage in it. And so one thing I'm looking for in this campaign is to see what the parties say about, say, the Canada Disability Benefit, which was very roundly panned when it came out for a degree of support. But are parties making proposals to improve it, to extend it, to, you know, what are they doing to take this piece of, you know, which could be part of a sort of form of guaranteed income? How are they trying to expand that? And we could look at other pieces around income support in this election and ask, well, are the parties actually trying to build a stronger minimum income, right, that allows people to deal with economic shocks and respond without being limited by the rules of EI, where people find it very hard to qualify in the current economy.
Great points. And thanks for that, Peter. We do have a question from John. I'm going to get to that in just a sec. Sheila, I want you to continue along Peter's line of thinking. And you've been somebody who has pushed for basic income for a lot of years, and have looked at studies worldwide around its effectiveness. What would you say in terms of opponents arguing that that's not something Canada can afford right now, especially in these uncertain times? How would you push back against that argument?
So my pushback is really easy. This is not difficult. We need to stop doing dumb things. And we are putting a lot of money into doing dumb things, like, as Peter mentioned, social assistance, which is simply pushing people out of society and out of the economy. If we are going to be a sovereign nation, if we are going to have a population that's going to build a better future, that's not the way to do it. Margaret talked about healthcare. One of the best ways to protect our healthcare systems is to keep a lot of people out of it who are there unnecessarily because they're not eating properly or they're living in a tent somewhere. And then we bring in the police to deal with the tents. And then we have kids who see no future, so they steal cars in Toronto. We're spending enormous amounts of energy and time and anxiety on really dumb things. Having some form of, basic income security that's unconditional, that everybody can count on, is really a much better deal for all of us. So I guess my political question in this is, again, it's like we have to understand there's a difference between politics and economics. So if the election goes the way the pollsters think it's going to go and we elect the economist, I'm not interested in who he is as a politician. I want to know if he's a democratic leader, because we need democracy in this country so that we, the people, actually have some freedom. One of the coolest things, if I can have like one more minute, one of the coolest things about basic income and these unconditional programs is that it allows for unpredictability. It allows for future options. It gives you the stability to deal with things that you don't know are coming at you. And therefore, it builds the resilience to build a better future. We're not going to build a future based on all of the stuff that's happened in the past. We need to learn from that and go forward.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I'm going to get to a couple of audience questions before we move on. It's great to see our good friend John Mills on the call. So John has a question specifically about healthcare and says, Margaret spoke about the healthcare system, which is in the process of failing. due to provincial ineffectiveness. Is that a federal money problem or plain mismanagement? So I don't know if you want to go first, Margaret, but certainly all our panelists can weigh in if they'd like.
So there's two things. One is the system, and then the preparation for the system. So first of all, we don't have enough students in the system. So I see that, and I'm like, we don't have enough medical students. We don't have enough people training into the system to become doctors. It's a closed system. So we need to open that up. And then I'm sorry, could you say the second part of the question again? Could you just repeat it again?
Yeah, let me just grab it again. Is it a matter of provincial ineffectiveness, and should we be looking to the federal government, particularly during this federal election, to improve funding? I would suppose would be the
So the improvement of funding would be to tie it into outcomes and to make sure that the federal funding that's designated for healthcare in the province actually goes to healthcare in the province, because healthcare is a provincial responsibility. So any failure of the system lies with the province, because it has been, again, turning to a privatized model slowly and surely, incrementally, maybe practice by practice, or condition by condition, maybe, that we see becoming delisted from the universal care. So really, it's provincial mismanagement of the system, of the funds that come from the federal system, and lack of accountability, which I think is the problem.
Thanks, Margaret. Any other thoughts from Peter or Sheila? Good with that. I'll move on to the next question. So it's the question is, we see the big picture, but how do we make the government see this? We've been advocating for years, and I worry people are just getting tired of the fight. So how do we encourage politicians to think long term, I suppose, is the question, and not about immediate political futures. Sheila, would you like to take that one on?
Gee, thanks, Tom. This is like such a small question. If anybody really knew what the answer was, they'd have a Nobel Prize already. I don't know. But I was at this democracy conference last weekend, and we were divided up into different workshops, and we were supposed to be, looking at futures and things. And one of the tasks we had was to look at what was going for us in Canada. And what our group identified, and we were like the capitalist group, what our group identified as a real strength in Canada is that we do have a really strong and active civil society. So there are lots of people out there fighting. I think part of the issue is that we're all now trying to do the government's job, because it has failed in terms of social governments, plural, because they've failed in terms of social policy in really building a strong economy and society. But that civic engagement is there. People are getting tired, but people are also supporting each other. I see a lot of people talking about forming coalitions and working together across issues, building synergies, looking at where we share common goals, where we're not perfectly aligned, but we're aligned enough that we can get together and push. And I, in a terrible, terrible way, I see the American threats as something that's going to help some of us align even more on the civil society front in Canada. It's a hope.
Yep, absolutely. And I'm going to turn the question over to you now, Peter, because one of the things I was going to ask you about is around voter engagement, and particularly around groups in society that may not vote in as high numbers as other groups. So I'm thinking certainly low-income residents of our communities tend not to vote in as high numbers. Young people tend to not vote in as high numbers as seniors, for example. What dynamics are at play there, Peter? And do you see that changing in this particular election or not?
Oh, I don't want to predict the worst, But ultimately, our politicians at the moment are out to get votes, and they are looking to convince people to go and vote for them. And if groups of people don't vote at very high rates, there's not a lot of votes that they can get from them. And the result of that is that the issues and interests of those groups are ignored in our political process. So, looking at, for instance, what the parties have put in front of us in terms of housing in this election, a lot of it is aimed very much at the middle class. And if you look at the tax cuts they've proposed, also very much at the middle class. So they aren't talking about, well, what can we do for renters? They're not talking very much about what we can do for low-income individuals. Now, I mean, the CCPA has put out on their website, policyalternatives.ca, some useful resources trying to break down what the different parties have been saying on things like tax cuts and investments. And so it's a useful place to go. They aren't all saying the same thing, but for the most part, they're aiming at the middle class because that's where the mass of the votes are. And so if people don't vote, there's a real loss of of voice. I think we also see it in the candidacies that parties put in front of us. If we don't see ourselves, then we won't vote. And so, even in terms of the number of women nominated for candidates, we're down slightly from past elections this time around, some parties more than others. But there's very few low-income Canadians who actually even become candidates, and probably next to none in our House of Commons. And so if people aren't reflected, it's easy for them to lose hope. But at the same time, it becomes a vicious circle because our parties aren't going to go out and try and win those votes if they know those groups aren't voting. So, coming back, I guess, to Sheila's point before, I mean, we have a problem in our system that our political parties are very weak. They don't have a lot of members. They don't exist much between election times. And so we don't have a lot of people who are going to go and mobilize low-income people to vote. So some of the most important things is a knock on the door, as a phone call, things to remind people that an election is on and that their vote matters. But our parties are doing less and less, in fact, to reach these people. Again, because they don't, in many cases, have many resources, or to the extent they have resources, they're going to continue to concentrate them on the middle class, where most of the action is at the ballot box.
Yeah, good points, Peter. Thank you very much. And I'm going to carry that thought on to ask Margaret my next question, because one of the challenges we've seen, at least according to pollsters, is a bit of a divergence, particularly amongst younger voters, some of which may be more influenced, particularly young people who identify as male, maybe being a little bit more swept up by the Trumpian sort of call to action. And you've written about how Trumpism has seeped into Canadian politics, Margaret. Where do you see that influence showing most visibly in our public debates and political rhetoric, or is it also in our policy choices?
Well, I think it's in all of the above, of course. I think most visually or most evident to most people is the political rhetoric that I hate using things like it's never been like this before, all in my, but I look at this and I think I cannot recall a time then in my awareness of political activity where there's been so much disrespect and outright aggression directed towards political opponents. So, it's couched within a kind of comedic framework where it's meant to be funny and it appeals to a certain type of puerile, juvenile sense of humor that I would argue is particularly strong amongst a particular age group of men. And so there's that, and how that's being amplified by a right-wing press that has been pushing this narrative and of discontent with the status quo, but discontent with the status quo in a particular way, not in a we have to fight for unions discontent. We have to fight for more individual freedoms that have been somehow being taken away from us, and we're being aggrieved, right? There's a sense of aggrievement about that group of because they don't have the jobs. They may have thought that they've done everything right, and they're not getting the results that they wanted. although I hate to turn to things like the rise of feminism and the rise of the strength of women, women's opportunities, as them being in response against, and that's been growing for some time. That isn't something that's just happened with Trump, but he's been tapping into this discontent, and that discontent is very fertile in that group. And so that's the political rhetoric is one thing, and then the way that the some politicians are discounting the media, the mainstream media, the legacy media, and moving more towards this. I just read Mark Brewery's book on Pierre Poilievre called Ripper, and he identifies 3 types of media. One is the mainstream media that we all kind of grew up with. The other is social media, which has exploded over the last 15 or 10 years, whatever, 15 or 10 years, which has become, I'm at loss for words to try to describe exactly how terrible social media has become. And then there's also this kind of pseudo media that he calls it, which is really propaganda. And that's where media outlets are showing up, popping up, and they're popping on off a lot of times. They're populated, and the main spokesmen are men, and they're talking about conservative values. Like when I talk about conservative values, not red Tory conservative values, but sort of reform Preston Manning conservative values. That's a different type. And so they're engaging with that. They see themselves as lost. That type of media has been really successful in attracting people who think they are revolutionaries to a cause. And I think that's where the real attraction lies.
Yeah. Thanks, Margaret. And yeah, I think we all know this, but it's important to state as well. Americans are not a homogeneous group, and John Mills makes a strong point in the next question, because he reminds us that AOC and Bernie are bringing community members together in the U.S. And here in Canada, we have Charlie Angus, John notes. But what is the solution to bringing real community together? People are tired, but they are energized enough to push our politicians, regardless of who wins. So I'll throw that out to all 3 of our panelists. Is there any sense of hope that we might be able to engage in that sort of similar dialogue here in Canada? Do any particular political leaders stand out for you who could help lead that charge?
Can I take this on?
Sure, Margaret. Yeah, go ahead.
Because it was something that Sheila had said earlier that reminded me about this. We can't forget what we did in Ontario in terms of the Greenbelt, and how a group of people mobilized the community to fight against what they saw was overreach by the government, and not just overreach, but outward lying and malfeasance even, and how those people did affect change. So many times we see protests, we see petitions, we don't know that they've actually gone anywhere, that we may have signed them, but we don't know that there's actually been a change. But here we see with the way that people mobilized around the Greenbelt, that the government actually walked back their policy and got an RCMP investigation into the whole deal. But this was people, grassroots people, getting together and communicating and fighting for something. And it was a win. And we can't forget that sometimes we do win. And that, I think, is a really important thing to take away, because it often feels as though it's just a constant struggle. So, I mean, there's a small win with basic income when Ontario decided to pilot it. And then it was a huge loss when it was canceled. So, we have to focus on the wins and keeping going forward for them.
Thanks, Margaret. Sheila or Peter, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just offer, based on John's commentary, that like AOC and Bernie and oh my God, I'm having a senior's moment. His name escapes me. The congressman who did a more than 24-hour speech, whatever. Anyway, the Democrats being honest and recognizing some of the ways in which they kind of mishandled Cory Booker. Thank you. The ways in which they kind of let things get away from them, I think offers a really good lesson for people in Canada if our politicians are paying attention. But I also think there's really, like, we have to get over our US obsession. They are weakening. Capitalism is falling apart. Like, whatever they're trying to do, it's not going to work. So there are other places around the world, almost everywhere, where things are better, where there are better social programs, including lots of Asian countries. I mean, the US is really terrible at social policy. Canada's much better. So we've got things to build on. And, you know, we've got the ways to do it here. If we can get some people, I don't know where those champions are. Like, we need more of them for sure. And it's not going to happen in this election because the election is revolving around Trump. But there's lots of places to go for inspiration. We're not alone and we can do this.
I'm going to throw the next question to Peter. It comes from Jody and specifically around voting in this election. So how do we make it easier to get people to vote? I think there are so many barriers that seem small to most, but are huge to those struggling to survive day to day. Peter, any thoughts on improvements or initiatives that would help encourage greater voter participation in this election or future elections?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it is very easy to vote in a Canadian federal election. The registration is, for most, is very straightforward. There's advanced polls. But it remains that, yeah, there are reasons in people's lives which making that time to get there is very complicated. And so I think there's probably two things. I mean, one is, I suspect if what was being offered to people was a lot more exciting and they felt that it was actually going to be delivered, those small but real things would be circumvented, right? If you have 80 things to do in a day and you can only do 50, you'll do those 50, but that might actually count among those 50 if we had things that were really going to vote actually would seem to produce some kind of impact and make one's life better. But I think the other thing is to have political parties with some capacity that they can help the people get to the polls, remind them when the polls, do the sorts of acts that make it easier for people, that provide the information when they need it, provide the ease of just making that final connection to be able to go. And our parties are very weak organizations. And so in most cases don't really have the capacity to reach people in that way. I mean, in the past, other organizations mattered. I mean, things like a workplace organization like a union would push people to vote. But we're less connected to these organizations. And so their capacity as well to create a culture of voting isn't there. And again, it's not just a culture, but it's also providing ways of, I'll look after your kids so you can go and vote, or those kinds of things that just break down those last barriers to being able to get to the polling place. So I'm sure there's a few things Elections Canada could do to make it a bit easier to vote, but for the most part, I think when we look internationally, it's a fairly straightforward process, but it's more that last piece of, are we organized together, kind of getting to the last questions, right? What is the level of social organization? But the other thing is, do our parties actually offer things that make it worthwhile for people to go and cast that vote? Because making that choice could make a tangible difference in one's life.
Just to follow up on that, Peter, what about the structure of the electoral system itself? We've had discussions in Canada for a while now about switching up how we elect our representatives. There was talk about proportional representation 10 years ago. Do you see any hope for that in the near future or even medium term?
Uh, well, I mean, the conversation keeps going. So that's already something. It hasn't disappeared in the way it has in past waves of discussion. I think we need some jurisdiction to adopt it, and that may be enough of a demonstration effect, with some province or the federal government. But I don't think it will increase voting rates that greatly. I mean, comparatively, it's a bit higher in proportional representation countries. But I think it does mean that citizens have a broader range of choices. And to that last question, they may see the point of going to vote for a certain party, which now, well, why would you vote for them? Because they don't have a chance in that riding, or maybe they don't have a chance in any riding. But if you were looking at a proportional system, getting that vote in the box might make a difference in terms of having some representation in Ottawa.
Great. Thanks, Peter. So we've talked a lot about threats and challenges to Canada, but I'll put the question out to all three of our panelists. What gives you hope for Canada to chart its own path in these difficult times? Are there a few things that stand out to you? Sheila's talked a little bit about that already, but any signs of hope for you going forward?
You want any particular order? You want me to jump in?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Sheila.
Okay, because this is where we last year around this time were preparing for a May Basic Income Guarantee Forum, the first truly kind of all Canadian event in a movement that has, spanned over a number of years. And the themes that came out of that forum, I think, offer a lot of hope. And the first one was that there actually is hope and energy in being for something. So, Margaret talked earlier about, this cohort that's just angry at everything and disappointed in everything, and they're against everything. And mostly they're against government as if, they're the enemy. What we heard at this conference is that if you have a positive policy idea that really is going to be good for people, it's hopeful and it's energizing. The second theme was that the evidence is there. I saw this somebody sent me a little social media thing. I'm not on social media, stating that according to their probably not very factual kind of representation, but they said, so there have been about 77,000+ now different trials of different basic income ideas. And they all show the same thing, but what we don't have, they all keep saying, well, they're short term, we need a longer term thing. And she said, so let's do that. Let's give it to everybody all the time now. And that's so the evidence is there. The third theme was that Canada has the building blocks to do this because we already deliver these kinds of programs to seniors and to families with children. It's that middle group that is so caught up in our economic neoliberal capitalism system, that 18 to 64-year-old group, we're supposed to be as machine-like as possible. And therefore we're suspect. But we've got the evidence that, we can build that out. We've got the building blocks. It would save us a lot of money and a lot of grief. And then the last one, and I was going to mention, all of these pilots and things are international. The latest one that came out just last week was the results of a pilot that was run in Germany by Grundeinkommen. And, it documents, again, the same positive benefits. So we've got something to work towards. We're not just fighting things. And then the last one I alluded to earlier is that there is so much hope in synergies. Our governments tend to work in silos. People are voting in silos for a particular issue here and there. But civil society is coming together to look at, how similar things are going to be able to help the planet, help healthcare, help income security, help us reclaim freedom that's been defined terribly by the right. And that is hopeful. And you look at history, we've been through hard times before. We've been living in this country. Margaret and I were talking earlier before we began about how we've lived this extraordinary life and we're not so affected now by some of these changes. But my father came to Canada post-Russian Revolution. That we have to look at history. We've overcome hard times before, and like we can do this.
Thanks for those inspiring thoughts, Sheila. I'll turn it over to Margaret. What makes you hopeful for the future?
The continuity of the past, the fact that, again, as Sheila says, we've been here before. We've encountered these challenges. It's ongoing. The questions that we're facing today are really no different at the very basic core of them than we faced 200 years ago, in terms of how do we take care of the most vulnerable? How do we move forward as a community? How do we represent ourselves politically? Those kinds of things. The thing that really complicates it for me in terms of hope is the impact of technology and how technology has become a real challenge. Like Sheila, you said you're not even on social media. I don't want to engage with technology to the extent that I have to, but I have to in order to be a part of a functioning society, sort of thing. And there was something I was reading recently about a process that a government wanted to bring in, and it would be completely technological. It would be so, can you imagine? I think of the older people who are older than me, who still struggle with very simple tasks, and how we're bowing down to technology. We're letting technology do so much for us that we've forgotten how to process and do things for ourselves and for our neighbors. And we're letting technology step in and do that for us. So I think that complicates my vision of hope, that if we could wrangle our use of technology and really turn it into a force for good, then we would see a lot more benefit, like a democratization of benefit over a greater number of people. But I don't think we're seeing that. We're seeing that as technology is still being used to advance the haves against the have-nots. And the only thing that keeps me going is the fact that I'm on the show right now, and I have to say that because really there's not much that keeps me going. I have grandchildren, and I'm going to say that that's what keeps me going, because I have to hope that there's going to be a future for them, and that our love for our children will actually lead us to a better world.
Thank you, Margaret. That's a really nice way to end your thoughts. Peter, last word to you. What gives you hope about Canada's future in these turbulent times?
Well, Margaret has thankfully set the bar low, so I won't have to be too optimistic. Although when you teach young people every year, you want to think about how they can make a different world. We live in a time of danger, and so there's also opportunity in those kinds of moments. And the key is to find ways to seize that. The Canadian political class put all their eggs in this basket of our relationship with the United States being a harmonious one, and they failed us. And so we're in a moment of having to really rethink how we organize ourselves economically and socially. And so there's space for us to have new ideas that were deemed, not sufficiently rigorous in terms of the relationship and so on with the United States. And so I think it's a moment to look to that and to look at maybe some things that have gone well in recent decades. Not to overemphasize it, but I think we're doing slightly better in trying to walk the path of reconciliation. And so that's, I think, something where we can think about how a new Canadian nationalism has to include that rather than ignore that and pull back from that. And we've seen a growth in the size of program spending of the federal government over the past decade with the introduction at the margins of some new social policies. And so maybe those are things that can be built out looking forward rather than thinking that that's the extent of our achievement on those. So those would be a couple of places where I'd say we have projects, maybe not hope, but we have hopeful projects, right? Things that we can build together to continue to produce a Canada that reflects a sense of, what have we achieved together in solidarity.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, Sheila, for sharing your insights and perspectives this afternoon. And thanks also to everybody who joined us on the call. We're going to make this available on our website and try to get the conversation up as a podcast as well in the near future, so we can share it widely. A couple thoughts just to end with. Democracy doesn't defend itself, sovereignty isn't guaranteed, and social programs will not survive without all of us fighting for them. So we are living in a challenging moment, but I took away a sense of hope, I think, from this conversation. But the most powerful thing any of us can do, I think, over the next couple of weeks particularly, is go out and vote, either at an advanced poll or on April 28th at your voting station. Canada's future is in our hands, so let's make sure we choose it. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay engaged. We'll keep working together on these and other issues. Today, we highlighted a couple of important features of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction's ongoing work, and we're going to be exploring those a little bit deeper in some upcoming webinars. So next month we're going to be looking at housing, and we're calling this one "Finding Home: Beating the Housing Crisis." And I'm hopeful our friend Laura will be back in the moderating chair to take on that big and powerful issue. And we also talked a little bit briefly today about the Canada Disability Benefit, which will be rolling out in May, I believe. So at June's webinar, we're going to be taking a little bit of a deeper dive on the Canada Disability Benefit and talking about who's eligible and what some of the challenges might be to getting on that important program. And as Peter outlined earlier, it's not nearly enough at $200 a month, but it can be of some assistance, and we have to continue advocating for an expansion of programs like that, and hopefully one day a universal basic income for everybody. So we'll see where that goes, but thank you all for participating, and we will see you again next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you.